Let's talk about the gay rights activist who marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and who referred to himself as the Forrest Gump of activism because he did so many different things, Kiyoshi Kuromiya. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. Stephen Kiyoshi Kuromiya was born in the Japanese internment camp at Hart Mountain, Wyoming on May 9, 1943, and he spent most of the first 3 years of his life there. He joked in later interviews that while many activists can say they've been jailed, he was one of few who could quite honestly say that he'd been born a criminal. The Kuromiya family returned to Monrovia, California after the war, and Kiyoshi spent the rest of his childhood and his adolescence there. He says he knew that he was gay from a very young age, but he didn't have language to describe his queerness until he snuck into the reference section at the LA County Library and discovered a copy of Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male when he was 10. When he was 11, he was arrested for lewd conduct with a teenage boy in a public park and held in juvenile hall for 3 days. Kiyoshi said in a 1997 interview that he couldn't look up the word lewd at the time because he couldn't figure out how it was spelled, so it took 3 years for him to really understand what he'd been arrested for. Like many other activists of the time, Kiyoshi said that he was radicalized by a U.S. government propaganda film called Operation Abolition, which he saw while he was in high school. Produced by the House Un-American Activities Committee, the 1960 documentary about a group of students disrupting a field hearing in San Francisco City Hall is meant to show the dangers of students being radicalized by communist ideology, but it backfired pretty spectacularly, especially after the ACLU put out a response film called Operation Correction. Kiyoshi secured a full scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania and started there in fall of 1961 studying architecture. He threw himself headfirst into activism and into Philadelphia's queer community, but not so much into his classes, which he found boring and uninspiring. He dropped out after a few years, but stayed in Philadelphia. Kiyoshi met Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Ralph Abernathy and James Baldwin at the 1963 March on Washington, and he continued to work closely with King until his assassination in 1968. He was one of the activists who was severely beaten by Alabama state troopers during a voting rights demonstration in Montgomery on March 16, 1965. And in fact, he was injured so badly that King briefly feared Kiyoshi was dead because the hospital wouldn't release any information on him. But a gay orderly helped Kiyoshi sneak a statement to the press. 4 months later, Kiyoshi was back in Philadelphia participating in the first annual Reminder Day picket, which he also marked as his official coming out. Kiyoshi's activism included anti-war efforts during the Vietnam era, and he understood, perhaps better than most, what would motivate white people to turn out for protests. So in April of 1968, he released an anonymous press release saying that a dog was going to be burned alive on the steps of UPenn's Van Pelt Library to dramatize the destruction and horror of napalm. The story exploded in the press, the ASPCA released an angry statement, and Senator Joseph Clark officially condemned the action. Approximately 2,000 people turned up to protest the use of napalm on a dog on April 26, 1968. Of course, there was no dog or napalm, but there were leaflets that read, "Congratulations on your anti-napalm protest. You have saved the life of an innocent dog. Now your efforts should turn to protesting Dow Chemical and the U.S. government's continued use of this genocidal weapon against the civilian population of a tiny country 10,000 miles away. You have saved a dog. Now how about a child or a million children?" He is also the creator of this iconic protest poster, which did get him arrested by the Secret Service 2 days after he returned from King's funeral. He fought the charge of distributing crime-inciting materials through the mail for 3 years until the Supreme Court ruled in Cohen versus California that the phrase "fuck the draft" is protected by the First Amendment. In the months following Stonewall, Kiyoshi co-founded the Gay Liberation Front with Basil O'Brien, writing in the Free Press, "Homosexuals have burst their chains and abandoned their closets. We came battle-scarred and angry to topple your sexist, racist, hateful society. We came to challenge the incredible hypocrisy of your serial monogamy, your oppressive sexual role-playing, your nuclear family, your Protestant ethic, apple pie, and mother." The GLF was one of the more radical queer activist groups at the time. They actively recruited a diversity of members and expressed solidarity with both the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party. In 1970, Kiyoshi represented the Gay Liberation Front as an openly gay delegate to the Black Panther Party convention in Philadelphia. With the start of the AIDS epidemic, Kiyoshi shifted his focus to become both an AIDS activist and a researcher, and he was a founding member of ACT UP's Philadelphia chapter. He himself was diagnosed with AIDS in 1989, but believed that he contracted it in the early 80s. Kiyoshi taught himself everything there was to know about alternative therapies for HIV and AIDS, to the point that he was frequently asked to sit on panels about it at the National Institutes of Health, and he worked closely with Anthony Fauci. He operated a medical marijuana buyers club to distribute marijuana to AIDS patients, and he sued the government over their prohibition of it, arguing that medical marijuana was much more effective in treating side effects from the new HIV medications than anything else on the market. He lost the suit, but kept operating the buyers club anyway. He also believed that knowledge was power, and since he had the ability to read complex and cutting-edge research papers and journal articles and break the information down for lay readers, he founded the Critical Path newsletter, one of the first publicly available resources for HIV information. He mailed it to thousands of subscribers around the world and to hundreds of incarcerated individuals for free. He also created one of the world's very first websites for the purpose of sharing all of this information about HIV and AIDS. As if all of that wasn't enough, Kiyoshi also expanded the Critical Path project to provide free internet access for AIDS patients throughout Philadelphia. He ran a community chest to help AIDS patients get their medication at no cost to them, and he set up a 24-hour hotline that he manned by himself all the time. His friend and fellow activist J.D. David said Kiyoshi was one of those people who physiologically didn't need sleep. Somewhere in there, Kiyoshi also managed to work as techno-futurist Buckminster Fuller's right hand and to become a nationally ranked Scrabble player. One of Kiyoshi Kuromiya's last acts of civil disobedience was on October 6, 1999, protesting the U.S. government's threat to sanction countries that were trying to make generic HIV medications available at a low cost. He died 7 months later, on May 10, 2000, the day after his 57th birthday. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.